Hi. So I have never done a YouTube video ever before, actually. Um, Nothing, just talking about stuff that I felt like is important that needed to be said. And lately, I keep feeling like there is some stuff that I want to talk about that I feel like is really important that people should know. And so I just finally made the decision that I'm going to give it a shot. But I am filming this on private because I don't know what I'm doing yet at all. So I will watch it afterwards and decide if it's worthy of being shown. But the topic that I want to talk about today is actually addiction, which has been a really major theme in my lifetime with a lot of the people that I love and are super close to me. And I feel like people have a hugely gross misunderstanding and simplification of addiction. And I feel like that misunderstanding and simplification wouldn't be such a big deal if it wasn't so incredibly dangerous to the addicts themselves. And so, being someone who, has loved and does love multiple addicts, I care about their well being. And I think that this is something that more people need to talk about and more needs to be said about it so that we can start changing um, the underlying themes in our culture of what we believe to be true about people who are addicted to drugs. And when I say drugs, I'm including everything in the category of things that you can become addicted to. So I want to expand that to include gambling addictions, sex addictions, alcohol addiction, opiate addiction, prescription drug addiction. Like, I'm talking about everything here because it all falls into the same category. Um, I heard Johan Hari say something that I thought was really interesting. He's a researcher on addiction and depression. And one of the things he said was that saying drugs and alcohol is like saying fruits and apples. They're the same thing. And putting them into a different category like that, trying to set alcohol aside from drugs, I think is just a way for our brains to be okay with using alcohol, right? Like, we don't want to feel like we're a drug user because we drink on the weekends or have a glass of wine with dinner. And so we have this tendency to say, the war against drugs or the war against drugs and alcohol or drug and alcohol abuse. Like, we're trying to put it in its own category. And I think the reality is that all of those things that I mentioned really don't deserve their own category. They're all issues. They're all really big issues that people struggle with. And so, just as I'm talking throughout this video, I just want you to know that if you're struggling with any one of those things, like, I'm talking to you and about what you're going through as well. I just want this to feel inclusive. So, little bit about me, I guess, to start this off. I am a co-founder of a nonprofit called Second Chance Ranch. And we are a horse rescue that also works with addicts who are in recovery. And we just encourage addicts to join us and to help us work with these rescue horses because we believe that um, horses are really interesting in that they're mirrors of human behavior. And you may have probably have heard the saying that people will put you up on a horse, and I'm sure you've heard, now don't be scared because the horse can feel your fear. So don't be scared because then the horse will get scared. And that's incredibly false, actually. It's like a very weird simplification of what's going on. When you get on a horse and you are frightened, or when you're just, in a round pen facing a horse and you're frightened, horses don't absorb and feel your emotion, they reflect your emotion. So if you are angry, they will reflect anger back to you through their behaviors. If you're scared, they will show you frightened behaviors. If you're relaxed and happy, generally they're going to reflect a relaxed and happy behavior set back to you. And so it's not that they feel your emotion at their core necessarily. They're just reflecting it back to you and acting upon those like energy waves that you're sending to them. So I guess some people are probably watching this and being like, yeah, that's the same thing. They feel your fear. And that's fine if you want to think about it that way. But the reality is that it's just a little bit more complicated and actually more beautiful than that, because we believe that a lot of people who struggle with addiction are struggling with a lot of like emotional health issues. And so when you put someone who's struggling with emotional health issues into a situation where they have to work with an animal as large and as sensitive as a horse, they are going to reflect those emotional issues back to you. And in order to get through to that animal and be able to work with them, you're going to have to work through your own emotions and your own issues, because that's really what they're throwing back at you is your own stuff. And so it's a really powerful and underused tool, we feel like, to treat addiction. Um, when you A very good example is my husband actually is an addict, and he's been sober for a few years. But when he first started working with horses, one of the things that he really struggled with was his temper. He just had like a really incredible temper, and he would just get escalated and didn't know any self-soothing behaviors to calm himself down. And so he would just stay escalated. And when he first started working with horses, the horse would do something, or he would do something, someone in that group would get triggered, and the horse would get escalated, and then he would escalate to meet that level. And neither of them could calm down. It would just go on for hours sometimes of my husband being incredibly frustrated and the animal being incredibly frustrated. And I would usually, me or, someone else would have to step in and kind of separate my husband from the animal so that he could walk away and calm down, because he didn't have any ability to do that for himself in the moment. You had to like take him out of the situation for him to calm himself down. And so one of the really cool things that he's learned through working with horses is that unless he can de-escalate, the horse can't de-escalate. So if he wants to get through to the horse and teach them something or train them to do something, he has to learn to control that escalation behavior and get his temper under control and think logically and not just explode in emotion. And so it's a very real and live experience of training a horse. You're just training yourself to have better reactions and better emotional control. So it's super cool. And I can talk about more of that later. But I just wanted you to have an idea of, kind of our background and what we do. And we just bring people who are struggling with addictions to our ranch, and they work with these horses. And these horses help them to get better control over their addictive tendencies and their, unhealthy emotional behavior patterns. So one of the things, when my husband and I were kind of in the throes, I guess, of his addiction, he was severely addicted to opiates. And then after that, he became severely addicted to alcohol. When we were in the throes of this process, I was incredibly codependent, first off. Like, really, it was your typical alcoholic codependent relationship. And I really would get so caught up in these thought patterns of things like, if he loved me, he would stop. he loves alcohol more than he loves me because, he can see that this is making me unhappy. And if he loved me, then he would not do this thing because I would like to think that I wouldn't do something that would make him unhappy. Which none of those, all of those thought patterns are extremely codependent. They're very typical, like very standard for anyone who's in a relationship with an addict. But the reality of them is that they're actually not too far out of line um, with what our culture teaches us about addiction and about addictive behaviors and addictive tendencies. I remember I think it was fifth grade. It might have been, no, actually, I think it was sixth grade. I did the DARE program at school, which is like a really common program all throughout public schools, at least in Utah. I'm not sure about other states. I think it's a countrywide program. But basically, in this program, they teach you about drugs, and the main thing that you learn is that drugs are addictive, and if you try them, there's a good chance that you will get hooked on them. They teach you that there's like this hook in your brain that the drugs, like snap onto. And then once you do it once and maybe 2 or 3 times, then you're just addicted to it because these drugs just like grab onto that mental hook in your brain. Which is, yes, like it kind of makes sense, but in reality, it's not true at all. And it's actually a very dangerous simplification of what actually happens to an addict and how an addiction actually comes into play. My theory, and I'm not just a floater, right? There's a lot of researchers who talk about this kind of stuff, is that addiction is not about mental hooks, and it's actually not about the drug at all. There are plenty of people a good example is people who go to the hospital and have surgery or break something and they get prescribed opiates for that particular thing. And they might take opiates for, 5 days or 10 days or, for like certain severe cases, I think that there's people that take it for longer than that. And those people, a lot of them, when they come off of the drug, they are not addicts. So, someone can be in the hospital for 10 days taking opiates, and then they leave the hospital and they don't touch opiates again until, maybe they dislocate their shoulder or something and have to take opiates for a few days. In the meantime, before their shoulder gets fixed. The point, though, is that they don't immediately become junkies, especially not for short-term use, and even in a lot of cases, not after long-term use. I mean, there are people who I worked with a lot of senior citizens at one point in my life, and a lot of them were on some pretty strong prescription painkillers for back or knee issues, and they would be on these for weeks to months before they had their surgery or whatever surgery they needed. And then they would be on them for a few weeks after while they were healing. And then they would wean off of those drugs, and they were not addicts. So it doesn't really make sense to me, that story that you try a drug and there's some sort of mental hook in your brain and you become an addict. There are people that drink recreationally. Why aren't they alcoholics if alcohol is addictive? There are people that gamble for fun. Why don't we have more gambling addicts than we do? Like, what is the difference between someone who uses cocaine at a party, once or twice, and someone who becomes addicted to it and, whose life is ruined by it? There's something else going on there besides the story that these drugs are addictive, and if you try them, you will become an addict. Um, there's something more to that. And so, my theory, I guess, an emerging theory that a lot of people share, is that it's not so much that the drugs are addictive, it's that there are things that are lacking in these people's lives that are filled by that drug. And so, a really good example is they did a study on obesity. And in the study, they had like, I think it was 350 people that were all over 400 pounds. So we're talking like, extremely obese people. Obviously, to get to that size, you have to have some sort of a food addiction. If you don't have anything medical going on, that's causing that sort of weight gain. So, with this study, one of the things that they found that was a common trend throughout all of the participants was that many of them, at the same time that they started overeating, they actually were sexually abused. And so, for these people, the overeating was a way to become overlooked, right? Being overweight, a lot of people who are overweight are overlooked in our society. It's not necessarily, not for everyone, but a lot of people don't find it sexually attractive. So for a child who is trying to escape being sexually attractive and trying to escape the abuse that someone is putting upon them, this idea of overeating and becoming overweight to be safe from that sort of attention is not uncommon at all. And it was a super common trend throughout like this entire study. And so uh, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is just that there are people out there who are incredibly emotionally bereft. There are things that have happened in their lives, different situations that have caused them to be lacking the connectivity that human beings need. We need to feel connected and loved. And when we don't feel connected and loved, I mean, it's a need like needing food and water. Like it's incredibly important. And when we don't feel these things from the people around us, when we don't have those connections, we connect to other things. So that is when, someone who's feeling those emotions and is in that kind of situation, those are the people who get hooked on these drugs. But it's not that the drug is addictive so much as that it's that the drug is fulfilling a need for them. And whatever that need may be, it causes them to bond super, super closely to this drug or this behavior, whatever it is that they become addicted to, in such a way that they become obsessed with it. And the longer that you are obsessed with something and that you just keep going back to the same behavior or the same drug for soothing, for solving those like emotional needs that you have, the more your brain gets like, it beats this path. So I want you to imagine like two paths going through the woods, right? And one of them is paved, and the other one is you can just tell that someone has like walked in it through the brush. So like the ground is like kind of beat down, but it's not like an obvious path, right? Well, if you keep walking, if you keep skipping the sidewalk and taking the path through the leaves and beating down that ground over and over and over and over, eventually that path is going to become a very recognizable, obvious dirt road that is another option that your brain can take. And so I think that when people, they stumble into these addictions because there's this emotional lacking in their life, there's this connective need that's not being filled, and then they find this thing that fills that for them, and then they walk that path over and over and over and over and over until when they come to that spot in the road, they don't even see the sidewalk anymore because they've taken this path so many times. That's the road that they walk down. And so I think that's when we start seeing these crazy behaviors that make us think that addicts just don't have any self control or that they're weak, which is not true. And actually, I would argue that the addicts in my life that I've loved and lived with or just known are some of the strongest people that I have ever met. Like, these people go through hell on a daily basis. The amount of energy that it takes to exist in society when you've had an addiction is like, I mean, it's a lot more than the average person has to exert to go through a typical day. And so, what I'm saying is, well, let me give an example. So there's a gal that's been that is a friend of mine that's an addict that I have been. She's been living with us and at the ranch and kind of going through this process of practicing sobriety and learning to be sober. And we went to the pharmacy to pick up some prescriptions for her and my husband, and came home and set the prescriptions on the table. And at this time, she wasn't at a place where she was allowed to dose out her own prescriptions because there were like some issues with that. So we were dosing out her prescriptions for her each day. And there was a bottle of a specific prescription on the table, and my husband turned around for a second to put something away in the fridge. And before, you could even blink, she had taken a big handful of these pills and just swallowed them. And so I think that a lot of people would look at that and just be kind of like disgusted by the person and be like, geez, like, don't you not have any self-control? Like, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, I can see how people would think that. And I can see it because I used to think that way, actually. And even in this particular situation, I felt my brain going down that route of thought. And I thought, oh, like, it's like so frustrating. Like, come on. Like, the story I start to tell myself is, are trying to help you. We're doing all these things for you. You've got a place to stay, like yada, yada, me. Your brain kind of goes off. When the reality of that situation is that she saw the two paths. She saw those drugs on the table. And that dirt beaten path through the woods was so much more visible than the sidewalk to the left that she just darted down that path without thinking. It almost becomes like an automatic reaction. There's not this thought process of, oh, I'm going to sneakily take those pills and get fucked up and enjoy my day being fucked up. Like, that thought process is actually not happening for addicts. And I really think that if we could try to remember that, it would be a lot easier to be kind to the addicts in our lives. And so the example I like to give that helps to illustrate this is, imagine you're cooking a pizza at home, and your dog, if you have a dog or if you've known anyone who has a dog, you start cooking pizza, the smells start floating through the house. The dog's like right in the kitchen. They're like, oh, that smells good. Like, I'd like some of that, they're into the scent and the idea of the food. And you take the pizza out of the oven and you set it on top of the stove to cool off, and maybe you cut yourself a piece and you put it on the table and you walk away. And the dog, obviously, even if it's trained super well, will sometimes, if that piece of pizza is at eye level, they're just going to grab it and eat it. Now, that dog is not watching you cook that pizza thinking, ooh, I bet they're going to leave that pizza on the top of the stove, and I bet they're going to cut it up. And, ooh, if they leave it in a place where I can reach it, I'm just going to grab it. Like, they're not having those thought processes. They just are into the smell, see the pizza visually at their eye level, and then grab it, right? It's such an automatic kind of, not intrinsic, instinctual response, that there's really not a whole lot of thinking that goes into it. And so I'm not comparing addicts to dogs. I'm just saying that when you walk a certain path over and over and over and over enough times, you don't really have to think anymore about walking down that path. And I think that when addicts get really deep into using, it becomes like that. It becomes very instinctual, very unthinking, and it takes a really long time and a lot of concerted effort to start seeing the other path, right? To start like seeing that path and then being like, oh, wait, look around, look around, look around. Oh, look, there's a sidewalk. I could walk down that path instead. Like that takes a long time. And one of the most interesting things that I feel like we don't think about is that addicts are terrified of relapsing, actually. Every addict I've ever met is terrified of relapsing, and most of them relapse a lot. And I think in both the addiction society and in um, from the people that aren't addicts, we look at relapses as failures. And the reality is that relapses are opportunities to try to look at the other path. And without relapses, without these situations where you have to, choose, am I going to use this drug or am I going to try to, look around and see if there's another option? Without those opportunities, addicts really don't have a chance at becoming sober because you can't just remove the item of addiction completely from their lives. At some point, they're going to be faced with this again. And the only way that they can learn to not make that decision is by making the wrong decision and relapsing and evaluating that relapse and then going, okay, what am I going to do different next time? And it might take 10, 15 relapses to get to the point where you finally remember, okay, I'm going to look around and see if there's another way. And then they're going to see the sidewalk and then they're still going to run down the beaten path. And we're over here as the sober people beating our heads against the walls. We're like, why is this person still making, the decision that I don't want them to make? Why aren't they choosing sobriety? And I get that. And I totally sympathize with you because I've been there. But I just want you to think about relapses differently. They are not failures, they're practice. It's opportunities to try again. It's a chance to overcome over and over and over again. And sometimes, I know for my husband, he probably relapsed from the time that he started trying to get sober to the time when he finally was able to achieve, a full year of sobriety, which is a huge landmark for addicts. Things start to change at a year usually. He probably relapsed 100 times, maybe more. But I would say that every single relapse, we got as a team a little bit better at recognizing the symptoms of the relapse, prolonging the relapse, prolonging the periods of prolonging the periods of sobriety in between relapses. We got better at noticing triggers that were causing relapses. Like every relapse was actually this amazing learning experience and step that we had, painful step for sure, but regardless, step that we took that brought us closer to the point where he was able to stay sober for 3 months and then 6 months and then 1 year and then 2 years and so on. So this video is getting long. I guess for right now, and I have a lot more to say, but for right now, sorry, my back's starting to hurt from sitting in this position. What I want to say to you, if you are an addict or if you love someone that is an addict, you or your loved one are not weak. Um, Addicts are not worthless. They are not lacking in self control. They are not bad people. They are not, the scum of the earth that we need to just throw into jail because that's the only way we know how to make them sober. Um, all of that is incredibly false. Um, Drugs are not inherently addictive. And I hesitate to even say that because my brain stutters when I say that because I've been so culturally ingrained to think the opposite. But when you look at real life examples, the proof is undeniable. Drugs are not inherently addictive. They are addictive when people are in a certain state of suffering where their emotional needs are not being met. And then they become addictive. And then the person falls into this pattern of addiction, which physically rewires their brain to seek out that addiction. And the unwiring of that addiction is an incredibly long and painful process that anyone is capable of making it through to the other side. We need to stop thinking of addicts as these low-life people who have just made bad choices. And if they would just make the right choice, their life would get better. That's not true. They're not suffering because of their addiction. The suffering existed before the addiction ever did. The addiction exists because of the suffering. And if we could change our focus to focus more on helping alleviate people's suffering, I truly believe that the addiction would eventually begin to go away. I think that's all I want to say for now. Sit on that. If it's hard for you to wrap your brain around, don't rush yourself, but really just try to think about it because I personally know how hard it is to try to accept this reality. And it's hard for me to even say it because I know that the backlash is going to be insane. But we can't keep fooling ourselves into thinking that addiction is as simple as it is when reality is telling us that it's not. So that is all for now. That is your little tidbit on addiction from Second Chance Ranch, and hopefully there will be more to come.